Today's daf we're going to be learning is Megillah Daf Kaf Daled. Okay, this is the daf I call the daf about inclusion and people with disabilities. Anyway, it's it's a very interesting daf, and we're going to even get to read a bit of a Tosfot that I find very fascinating. With that, today's daf is sponsored by Tzvia Ross Korn for the Refuah Shlema of Yenta Bat Zelda, and today's daf is sponsored by Devorah Sabam for the Refuah Shlema of Neriat Yosef Hoshea Ben Avital. Okay, right. It's actually even I think it's Disability Week if I paid attention correctly. So it's actually nice that this comes out right now. Okay, I'm not sure if that's just in Israel. Anyway, I saw it somewhere, so very relevant. Starting from the mission at the bottom of Kaf Gimel Amud Bet. Okay, we're going to start off not really in that category, but we're going to move into it very soon. Hakoreh b'Torah lo yifchot mishlosha psukim. One who reads from the Torah should not read any less than 3 verses. Actually, I just remembered I wanted to point out something that we talked about yesterday. So before I start, I'm going to go back for a minute. I talked about the Haftorah for Parshat Tzav, and I said it always comes out on Shabbat HaGadol. So I checked. It doesn't always come out on Shabbat HaGadol. Most years, Parshat Tzav is the Parshat of Shabbat HaGadol, in which case we don't read that Haftorah that it says there. But in addition, if it's not, other years it comes out the same when it's a leap year. It comes out either Parshat Zachor or Parshat Parah, which also have their own Haftorahs. So Parshat Tzav, it's very, very, very rare. The Parshat Tzav falls on a week that doesn't have one of the 4 Parshiot, or either Parah or Zachor, or Shabbat HaGadol, which has its own Haftorah, and that's why this is a Haftorah that is incredibly rare that we actually read. So it's funny, the example they brought was specifically an example that we almost never read, so it's interesting. Okay, Becky says this year we're going to read it. Interesting, I didn't check that. That's interesting. Okay. Okay, I see the study guide you don't see, so here, I'll try to update it. Yeah, the study guide should be there now if you don't see it now. Okay. Okay, and I'll just, if I already stopped, I'll just make one more announcement, which is our Siyum. Okay, we actually finished the Masechet. The date to finish is actually next Thursday, but we're going to actually push the Siyum off to Sunday, as I mentioned last time, so that we can get more people to come from around the world. So it's a bit of an easier day. So our Siyum will be on Sunday. I didn't check what exactly the date is. I'll check right now. Sunday, January 16th. Okay, on Yud Daled B'Shvat. Right? It's actually going to be the night of Tu B'Shvat. In Israel, at least it'll be nighttime. And we'll do our Siyum then with Rabbanit Gila Rosen will be with us. And we actually are going to have a student. One of the schools in Israel has done a whole thing to get girls to learn Masechet Megillah. We're going to have an 8th grader from the school who's been doing Masechet Megillah who's going to share with us her experience. And we will, just to be clear, we're going to be a little out of order. So we're not going to learn the last daf on Thursday. Okay, so Thursday, there's no regular class. We're going to learn the last daf at the Siyum as usual. And on Friday, we'll start the new Masechet, and then it'll be a little bit out of order. So apologies. And yes, one last announcement. It's the 5th of January, which is the 2-year anniversary of the Siyum HaShas, and from when we started the previous cycle. So everybody should feel great about reaching this 2-year milestone. Okay, let's get started. We've already seen this many times. Someone who, we saw it, it's only in the Mishnah here, but there's no order, as you all know, to the Gemara. So basically this is mentioned, other times, but here it is in the Mishnah. If you read from the Torah, you have to read a minimum of 3 verses. But someone who's a Meturgaman, who's translating, can't translate more than 1 pasuk at a time. Okay, this is I can relate to this. Sometimes what I'm doing in this class, I read and then I translate. I read and then I translate. So I try not to read too far because then you kind of lose where you are and go back to translating. So when you read the Torah, because it's very important that everyone understand exactly what it says in the Torah, and we'll see why in a minute, or at least why Rashi says, therefore, pasuk. Okay, you can't go too far. You might forget what you were up to, what you translated and what you didn't. Ubanavi shlosha. But when it comes to the prophets, you can do 3 verses. So Rashi says, if you want, not that you have to, Rashi says in Yirtzeh, it's not really a big deal if you make a mistake, because there's no halachic relevance. Whereas the Torah, it's interesting to call the Torah a book of law, not exactly a book of law, but there are laws mentioned in there, and we don't want people to get confused by things. But when it comes to the prophets, it's not as critical that people understand everything, and if they make a mistake, it's not a big deal. But there's one caveat. You can't translate 3 psukim that are each considered separate sections, right? There's dividers between the sections in both the Torah and in the Nevi'im and all of Tanakh. If there's a section divider, well, don't translate the pasuk before the divider and after the divider together. Okay, do it by section break. Okay, this we actually do in a lot of the Haftorahs, or not a lot, but there are some. Like, for example, Shabbat Shuvah, we're reading from one Navi, and then we skip at the end, and we all of a sudden quote psukim from a different Navi. So you can do that in the prophets. You can skip to another section. But you can't skip in the Torah. You can't start reading a Torah section and then skip to another section, although we'll see maybe there are some exceptions. And we're actually going to see a sugya we've seen before. How far can you skip? Can you skip from, let's say, the first prophet of, Yehoshua, and then skip all the way to, let's say, Nevi'im Achronim Yeshayahu? So the Mishnah says, Ad Kadesh Lo Yifsok HaMetorgaman. No, you can't. There's an assumption here. Now, we generally don't read the prophets for the Haftorahs from a cloth, but if you were reading from a cloth, right, you have to roll it to the next spot. So as long as you can roll it during the time that the Torgaman is translating, the translator's translating to everyone, then you can do it. But if it's going to take longer than not, and what does this have to do with? Rashi actually calls it, which we saw yesterday, this issue of kavod hatzibur. The very end of that Rashi, before it starts with the Gemara, mishum she'ein kvod tzibur la'amod sham b'shtika. It's not fair, okay, and you would wish that everyone in shuls believed in this, right? Some shuls do, but not all shuls, that it's not appropriate to make people wait for no reason. That's not respectful to the community, right? We not only have to respect the Torah, you also have to respect the community and the people in the shul, right? First of all, I think there's another issue that Rashi doesn't mention, which is if there's lag time in shul, what generally happens? People start talking, and then it becomes disrespectful to shul because it's very hard to get people to be quiet. It's another problem. So in general, what we try to do is, right, move things very quickly so that there's no lag time, there's no breaks, right? Halavai, every shul would be careful about this. So therefore, you can only skip if you can get there while something else is going on and that you don't have this dead time. The Gemara says, Hane shloshah psukim kineged mi. What are these 3 verses? Okay, this is a question we keep asking throughout the Masechet, right? This number 3, this number 5, this number 7, this number this. What is it? Kineged 10 we had. So he says, why 3 verses? Kineged Torah Nevi'im Uktuvim. It's representative of the Torah itself, which is made up of the Tanakh, the 24 books, which fall into 3 categories. Now we're just quoting from the Mishnah. So now they want to know, what are you talking about? Where would you have a section that you have 3 psukim and they're all each in a separate section? That's very odd, right? You then basically have, the first pasuk could just be the end of the last section. Then the second pasuk would have to be its own separate paragraph, right? A paragraph generally is not made up of one sentence. And then the third one would start a new one. So is there really such a thing? To which the Gemara says, yeah, here's an example. Kigon, okay, if you open Yeshayahu chapter 52, you'll see this in the very beginning in Pasuk Gimel, Kiko amar Hashem chinam nimkartem. And then it says, Kiko amar Hashem Elokim Mitzrayim yarad imi barishona. And then it says, V'atzama liponu Hashem. Okay, I'm not going to get into what this means, but the point is there's a section break after verse 3 and a section break after verse 4. So there you would have 3 psukim that are each 3 different paragraphs. Midalgim b'navi ve'em midalgim b'torah. So now the Gemara says a Rimini, but wait a minute. It says in Yoma, Koreh acharemot ve'ach be'eso ve'ha kamidaleg. If you remember, the Kohen Gadol reads from the Torah on Yom Kippurim. And what does he read? He reads the 2 sections about Yom Kippur, right? From Parshat Acharemot, which is chapter 16 of Vayikra. And then he skips to chapter 23, where it talks about, right? So 16 is all what happens in the temple on Yom Kippurim, the whole Yom Kippur special service. 23 is Parshat Emor, which lists all the holidays, and he reads the part about Yom Kippur. So there you see, he skips from chapter 16 to chapter 23. And we just said, Emedagim Torah. So Amar Abai, we're going to have one answer, then we're going to reject it, and then bring a second answer. Amar Abai, lo kashya, kam b'chdei sheyifsak hatorgaman, kam b'chdei shelo yifsak hatorgaman. It all depends on if there's enough time. 16 to 23 is not very far. While the person's translating the verse, they quickly roll and they get to 23. So it's doable. But the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Ha'ala katani, it says right there, right? Where's right there? In the Mishnah. What did it say in the Mishnah? Remember? It said, midalgim b'torah ve'em midalgim b'navi, ve'ad kama hu midaleg, It says you can skip in the Navi, but you can't skip in the Torah. And when we say you can skip, how much can you skip? Ad shalev sakabator gaman, right? Ad kadei shalev sakabator gaman, right? Until the translate. Now that was all about the Navi. It wasn't about the Torah. So Michlal, from here it sounds like, but Torah klal lo. It sounds like the Navi you can skip as long as you have enough time to get there. But it sounds like the Torah, you can't skip at all. So that's not a good explanation. So Ela Amar Abai changes his answer. He says, Lo kasha. Kam b'inyan echad, kam b'shtei inyanot. You can skip if the topic is the same topic. You can't skip if it's two different topics. In the Navi, if it's two different topics, you can skip as long as you have enough time to get there. But in the Torah, you can only skip if it's the same topic. And even within that, okay, in other words, you can skip in the Torah as long as it's the same topic. Now there it was Yom Kippur, same topic. Right? Obviously, it was a bit of a different topic within Yom Kippur, but it's still the same general topic. When it comes to the Navi, you can even skip to a different topic. But both of them are only permitted if you can actually get there in time. Okay, Tanya Idach, another Braita. Okay, now you can't skip from book to book. Okay, so it sounds like until now we were talking about within Yeshayahu, let's say you're on chapter 1, you could skip to chapter 20 as long as you can get there in time. But if you're reading Trasar, okay, what's Trasar? There's one book of the Tanakh, and I call it one book because it's really 12 books. But when we say there's 24 books of Tanakh, we count it as one only. It's called Trasar. Trasar means 12. It's 12 books of prophets. So now they tell you, if you're within Trasar, you can skip from one to the other. That's what we have on Shabbat Shuvah. We switch from one Navi of Trasar to a different book. Okay, and we add those psukim. And there's a few other times where we do this. So you can skip within there, but otherwise you can only skip within a book. Okay, you can do research and see if that's really true. We never skip, let's say, from Yirmiyahu to Yeshayahu or something like that. You can't skip, though, from the end of the book to the beginning. Okay, now there's a debate what this means. Does that mean you can't skip from one of the later books in Trasar to an earlier book? Or does it mean within a book, you can't switch the order, like read from chapter 9 and then from chapter 2? Okay, there's a debate about what this means, right? You can see a logic to saying the order of Trasar maybe isn't so significant, so you could read from a later book and then go to an earlier book, although it is somewhat significant, it's somewhat historical, chronological, but I mean, it doesn't really matter chronology when you're reading from the prophets. It's not like we're telling a straight story. Or maybe it means within a book, there's a particular order, and that order you have to keep to. Again, with skipping, but not going in reverse order. New Mishnah. Hamaftir b'navi hu pores hashma v'hu over lifnei hateva v'hu nosei et kapav. These are going to be issues we're going to discuss relating to a few different things about pores hashma, which we discussed yesterday. It's not 100% clear what it means. Seems to mean something that has to do with the first bracha of Kriyat Shema. Likely it has to do with the Baruch Hu et Hashem HaMevorach that we say before when we have a minyan. That was the whole thing about yesterday, that you need a minyan for it. And then he would also say the brachot, at least the beginning blessings of Shema, which the first one, and this is going to be relevant for the continuation, is Yotzer HaMeorot, that God creates the lights, right? The moon, the sun, things that bring light into the world. So, Hamaftir b'navi, the one who does the maftir, meaning what does the maftir do? He reads the Haftorah. He's reading from the Nevi'im. We already learned yesterday. He also reads a section from the Torah because it's not respectful to the Torah that he doesn't read anything from the Torah and just gets up and reads from the prophets. But now we're going to learn that this was a job that was a little bit not the most respectable job. It was usually given to younger children because they could do that, even though they also could read from the Torah. But generally, right, even though we say nowadays, not everybody does that. But right, there are different customs about whether a child can read from the Torah or not. But in those days, it seems like maftir was traditionally given to children. Therefore, if you were an older person who got maftir, they wanted to give you what we call in Hebrew a chupal, like pay you up some other way. Like it's not the nicest thing, or people wouldn't really want to do this. So they say, if you do that, we'll give you some other jobs as well that are more respectable jobs. So hu pores al shema, so he gets the honor to do the Prisat Shema. Hu over lifnei hateva, he could be the chazan, or maybe he's all these things. And hu nosei et kapav, and he, if he's a kohen, then he does Birkat Kohanim. Now, this is weird. Doesn't everybody do Birkat Kohanim, right? All the Kohanim get up. So this is a very strange, it's something that a lot of the commentators grappled with. Some people say it's talking about in a city where everyone's a Kohen, and maybe some of the people in the community don't do it, right? Because who are they going to bless if everybody's Kohanim, right? Probably rare to find a community where everybody's a Kohen. So that's a bit of a weird interpretation, although possible. And then it's trying to say he can also do that. Again, it's a bit of an issue what exactly is going on there. Some people think that this is really here because of the continuation. It just matches we're going to see this threesome of Poreis al Shema, Over Lifnei HaTeva, Nosei Kapav, and because of that, this came in here. Okay, it doesn't really mean that this is anything that makes him unique that he does this, but anyway, we'll leave that one aside. So this is the way we're compensating him for getting a lowly job. We're going to basically allow it. So you're asking, doesn't Shema come before Maftir? Right. So that's also another thing. But the point is, so Rashi actually says to respond to that question, the assumption is that Rashi's interpretation is he's the guy who usually does it. So since he's the guy who usually does it, we know already when it comes to the beginning of the davening that he's going to be the one to do it because he's the normal one. Therefore, we're going to give him that honor. Or maybe they were just organized about it, right? And they didn't just do it on the fly, but they knew already beforehand who was going to do the Haftorah. They planned it all out, and therefore they gave him the honor before. It's a good question, though. V'im haya katan, what if he's a minor? Then, right, he can't do all those other jobs because we're going to see aviv or rabo avlin al yado. So they get the honor for him. Okay, we're going to have a bit of a question about this. Why would they get an honor? Isn't the whole thing, didn't I just describe it, that it's not exactly the most respectful job, but if you're a katan, it's fine. So you don't really need any compensation. We'll talk about that soon. Now we're going to see what jobs the katan can do and what he can't do in shul. Katan koreh b'Torah, like we saw, and mitargem, he can also do the translation. When it comes to this threesome that we just described, he can't do any of those. Okay, we see why we got here, because the whole thing was, you can't compensate the katan with those, so you compensate his father or his rabbi. Right? It's interesting to see that they treat his rabbi like his father. Okay, anyway. Pocheach. Okay, here, for all those who say laws of tzniut seem to only relate to women, here we have some laws of tzniut that relate to men as well. Pocheach is someone who's not dressed in an appropriate manner. We don't really know what the issue is. There's different interpretations. Some people say his legs are uncovered, right? So maybe it means he's wearing shorts. Maybe it means he's wearing less than shorts. Maybe he's wearing a tank top and his arms are revealed, his shoulders. Okay, it could be a tank top. It could be shorts. We don't know. Okay, it's not clear, but something where he's not fully dressed. Poreis et Shema mitargem. So what jobs can he do in shul? He can do this Poreis et Shema, and he can do the translation of the Torah. Aval eino koreh b'Torah. It's not respectful for the Torah to be dressed like that. Ve'eino over lifnei HaTeva. He can't get up and be the shliach tzibor for the Shmona Esrei. Ve'eino nosei et kapav. And he can't do Birkat Kohanim. Okay, so Rashi explains what's the issue. Right? It's not kavod shel tzibur liot kfufim lebirchato. Okay? Basically, he says, like when it comes to Birkat Kohanim, it's not appropriate for the community. It's not respectful that someone's not dressed the way they should be dressed in a shul, and they're giving out blessings. Okay? So there's an importance, right? This is, we're going to talk about the importance of Birkat Kohanim and how you look and how you present yourself, right? In terms of the bracha and the people, the way they perceive you when they're getting a bracha. Okay, and for the Torah, it's not respectful for the Torah or for the community if you're doing be a shliach tzibur. Suma. Okay, here we get to a blind person. Here's where things get very interesting. Suma poreis et Shema umitargem. Okay, he does the Shema, he can do that, and he can be mitargem. Okay, he can do the translation. The assumption is about Shema and the Targum that it's not as a significant part of the prayer. Of course, Shema is important, but first of all, Tfilah b'tzibur, generally, we talk about Shmona Esrei. Like that's the main thing. In Kriya b'Torah, we talk about Kriya b'Torah. These are both secondary to that, okay? So it's not that Shema isn't important. It's super important. But I think the Shema in the community is a little bit of a less importance than the prayer. They're doing like a hierarchy here. They're not saying you should go to shul dressed in a tank top if you plan to do the Poreis et Shema. They're just saying if you are, well, it's okay. Now, here we have a machloket about a summa. Can he poreis et Shema and can he do the Targum? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kol shelo ra'a ma'oro b'yamav, which means blind from birth. Okay, if he never ever saw light, eino poreis al Shema. How can we have someone who never benefited from the light talking about the benefits of light? That's what Yotzer Hamo wrote is about. So we don't want someone who's blind, who can't appreciate light, to talk about this. Soon we'll get to a debate in the Gemara, like a conversation between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis about why Rabbi Yehuda thinks this is a problem and why Tanna Kama doesn't think this is an issue at all. We'll get to a very interesting story. Okay, so now I want to just point out a really interesting Tosfot. Tosfot raises a question that relates to women as well, which also makes it very interesting. Tosfot raises an issue. He says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he basically is isolating, and this is what you're asking in the chat, only someone who's blind from birth. Someone who's not blind from birth can be Pores al Shma. Okay, that's the Gemara. If you look at the last Tosfot on the daf, Mishalo Ra'ama Orot Lo Yifros al Shma. Tosfot says, Kashe, Daha, this is difficult because Rabbi Yehuda, he's the one who says, okay, this is right. Tosfot is very good at this. They compare Rabbi Yehuda here to Rabbi Yehuda somewhere else. Okay, these are just tips in Gemara. This reminds me that I should just promote the class that's starting on Sunday of Rabbanit Leah Sarna about Gemara basics. This is like a good Gemara basic. Again, Tosfot's already less basic, but if you want to know basic ideas about what Tosfot generally does, they compare things within Masechtot. So they say, here, we have Rabbi Yehuda here, and let's look at Rabbi Yehuda somewhere else. And why is there a difference between them? There, Rabbi Yehuda says, Suma patur mikol mitzvot. And he says a Suma is exempt from all commandments, and he doesn't distinguish between whether he could see or not see. That means he's not obligated to lifros al Shma, and therefore he shouldn't, right? He can't do this for other people if he's not obligated. Here, Rabbi Yehuda says it's only if you never saw before, if you're blind from birth. So what's going on here? So now he says something really fascinating. First, he quotes the Yerushalmi, who says that maybe our Mishnah doesn't mean someone who's blind. Maybe it means someone who's in the dark and can't see anything. And then he shouldn't be because he can't say Yotzer Ma'orot if he can't see at that moment. It's a very interesting answer. But that's not what I wanted to focus on. So if you look at the third line of Tosfot, he says, Od yesh lomar. Here's what I want to suggest. It's really talking about a blind person. There, it's saying a summa is exempt from Torah laws. But midirabanan miachayev. Midirabanan, people who are blind are obligated in mitzvot that are dirabanan, they're rabbinic in nature. We can't obligate them in Torah obligations, they have an exemption. But we are going to obligate them in rabbinic mitzvot. Why? And then he says, va'afilu nistameh mishenolad, right? Even if he was blind from birth. In other words, we should make no distinction. Right here, the only distinction made is, did he ever benefit from light? That he could actually make this bracha and understand it. But when it comes to rabbinic things, and lifros hashma is rabbinic, because we're not talking about saying Shema, we're saying this beginning part of Shema, which is rabbinic, he's actually obligated. What's the problem? If he's blind from birth, though, he doesn't understand what it means to benefit, so he can't say it. But theoretically, he should be obligated. Now, why would the rabbis come along? And this is what's really fascinating. If really a summa is exempt from mitzvot on a Torah level, why do the rabbis come and obligate them in rabbinic laws? It seems weird. So he says the following. He's obligated under Rabbanan. Why? If we exempt him from all commandments, Torah and rabbinic, what will happen? He'll basically not really feel Jewish at all. And he'll be out of the circle. What brings you into the circle of Judaism? Doing mitzvot. If we exempt him from all mitzvot, he won't really feel part of Judaism, right? Which could be a good claim to women to saying, okay, it's true you have an exemption from all these mitzvot, but you should do them because don't you want to feel part of what's going on and understand and appreciate, right? The reason for learning. You might not be obligated to learn Torah, but it brings you into part of what it means to be a Jew, right? Which is probably part of the reason why a lot of you are learning Gemara. So now he says, but lo dami linashim. This isn't like women. Women are exempt from all these mitzvot. Why don't we say they're obligated under abundance? He says they're obviously not obligated under abundance. If you want to say, and some people actually suggest this, that the exemption is only for Torah commandments, not rabbinic. What's the problem with that? If you remember, we learned the famous sugya. We learned it in here. We learned it here. We learned it in Pesachim also. Remember in reading the Megillah, right? In Ner Chanukah. Why? Right now, if women are obligated in all rabbanans, you wouldn't need a special reason. The whole reason is there's a special reason to bring them in, but were it not for that, they'd be exempt. So there you see women, we don't have this. So he says, why distinguish between a summa and women? And he basically says, because women already do have a lot of mitzvot. They're only exempt from time-bound positive commandments, but there's all sorts of non-time-bound commandments that women are part of. So women already are part of things. They're not considered totally on the outs, whereas the summa, if we exempt him from all commandments, he'll basically be on the outs. And therefore, to be inclusive, and this is why I think it's fascinating, right? It's talking about people who are on the periphery and feel left out. The rabbis went, according to Tosfot's reasoning, they went beyond and said, we want to include you. We want you to feel part of things, right? It's hard to do it when they're actually exempt by Torah law. But in the ways that we can do it, we're going to include you and basically make you feel like you're a part of the Jewish people. We don't want you to feel on the outs. It's a very beautiful Tosfot in my mind. Okay, so that's Tosfot. And that's an interesting distinction he makes between women and a summa. Okay, my time. So the Gemara starts off and says, what's the reason for the maftir who gets compensated by giving him some other things? So Rav Papa says, Mishum kavod, right? It's disrespectful for him to get such a lowly, kibud. So we'll give him some other things. Rabbi Bar Shimi Amar Mishum da'ati l'insuye. It's going to create tension. Why? Because in those days, they paid the chazan. This is at least some way of interpreting. Some people say it's something else, but we'll go with that. They paid the chazan. So if you get maftir, you get a job that you don't get paid for. So therefore, he doesn't get to fight with the person who gets to the job of the chazan and gets paid. We basically let him get the job of the chazan as well, so he'll get paid for what he's doing. My benayu, so what's the halachic relevance between them? Right? If you're in a place where they don't pay the chazan, then the whole second reason drops off. Tanan, but wait, we have a question against that reason. It says in the Mishnah, they get it instead of the katan. There's no relevance to this whole argument if it's a minor. A minor can't get the job anyway to be a chazan. So there's no issue of he's going to be upset he didn't get the job. So to which they say, well, I'll turn the question back on you. You want to say it's not because they're going to fight over the job, because the katani doesn't even have a right to get the job. But it's if you say it's mishum kavod, then that's what you want to say, right? It's out of respect. The katan's going to be upset he got a lowly job because the job generally given to a minor, well, that doesn't make any sense. He is a minor, right? Katan bar kavodu. He doesn't say, oh, this is beneath my pay scale, or right, not paying, but you know what I mean. And can't say that because it's exactly where he's at. He's a katan, he's a minor. So neither one is really relevant for a katan. So therefore, it's the father. Because the way they understand it, there's an expectation here, okay? That the father or the rabbi is the way, I guess it worked in the communities, was the child got the honor that was relevant to the child, and then his father or rabbi got the other one. So that's why it would cause fighting or lack of respect. They'll say, I don't get the respect I deserve. They'll say, I wanted the job and I didn't get it. So achanami, you could say the same thing. Just like you could say there's kavod for the father or the rabbi, you could likewise say, ikanitsuye aviv and nitsuye rabo. Also, they would fight over the chazan job. So basically, both answers are potentially relevant here. Pocheach pores al shma. So now we're back to this person who's not dressed properly. Ba'amine ula barav me'abaye. Katan pocheach maushi kab Torah. Ula bar Rav asked Abaye. We had Ula bar Rav the other day, if you remember. Someone asked me about him actually after classes. It's the same Ula as the other Ula that we usually see. And I looked it up and I actually found that there's no real entry in most of these books. I couldn't find any on Ula bar Rav. The only thing I found was at the end of the Ula entry in the book that I have. And I also looked online. I couldn't find anything at the end of the Ula bar Rav, the Ula entry. It says there's another guy called Ula bar Rav who is 1 or 2 generations after the first Ula, and also moved from Israel to Bavel. And anyway, seems to be a different person, but not much is known about him. So he asked Abaye, before he asked Rava, right? You see he's in their generation, 4th generation. So Katan pocheach maushi Torah. What about a young child who's not dressed appropriately? Can he read from the Torah? Now here's a great question. You wonder, why is he asking this question, right? If it's inappropriate, it's inappropriate. So I, of course, thought of this story. My daughter was about 1.5 years old, and we went to the Botanical Gardens in Brooklyn. And we're walking around the Botanical Gardens in Brooklyn. It's a super, super hot day. And what does she do? She takes off her shirt, okay? And she walks around the Botanical Gardens without a shirt. Comes up a guy in a golf cart, stops us, says, excuse me, but there's rules here. You have to be wearing a shirt. And I saw, my daughter is a very, how do you describe it? Very strong in her opinions. So I say, okay, you have to put your shirt on. And she says, no, like she's unwilling to put her shirt on. And the guy's like, I'm sorry, but the rules are you have to. And I looked at him and I said, she's 1.5 years old. Like, I don't think your rule was made for 1.5-year-olds. That doesn't make any sense. So anyway, I think that's where the question comes from, which is at what age are laws of tzniut relevant? Maybe if it's a katan, then it's not It's not considered not appropriate. Like to me, a 1.5-year-old walking around with no clothes on is definitely not something that, at least in my mind, was considered not sanua. Okay. So I think that's his question here. If you have a minor and they're basically getting up to read from the Torah, but they're a minor, so maybe the issues of tzniut are not relevant. To which the answer is, the person who asked the question was more like the guy who stopped me in the golf cart and said, Amarlu, v'tibaylach arom, what if he was naked? Where do you draw the line? And of course, it's not appropriate. Arom, my time alone, mishum kvod tzibur. Hachanami, mishum kvod tzibur. It's not appropriate that, there be bare flesh around, basically, where people are around. Now, obviously, there's a distinction between a 1.5-year-old and a 9 or 10-year-old or 11-year-old who's reading from the Torah. Anyway, his answer is, this is mishum kvod tzibur. And by the way, I assume you notice this kvod tzibur issue keeps coming up in different areas. Seems to be a very important issue here about respect of the community and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in a shul. Summa pores al shma. Now we're going to get to this interesting conversation between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis about the blind person. Tanya. So the Breita says, Amrulo, here we're going to have a Breita with more of a discussion. This happens very often where we have our Mishnah gives us, okay, again, if we go back to some methodological points about Gemara, Mishnah often gives us, right, this isn't even Gemara, it's really about the Mishnah, gives us halacha, okay, this guy says this guy says that. It doesn't often give us once in a while, but it doesn't usually give us conversation and back and forth, which you often find in Breito, which were other sources from that time that didn't make it into the Mishnah. Sometimes also they come from the Tosefta. This happens to be also in the Tosefta. It's very common. Tosefta has an expanded version. Okay, that's right, another book written at that same time period. Amrula le Rabbi Yehuda, her beit safu lidrosh b'merkava v'lo ra'u tami mehem. They said to Rabbi Yehuda, okay, you want to exclude the blind person from Pores Hashma. But I'll tell you, this is a great line for also inclusion and all that, and people who are, different than other people. Everyone has issues, right? There's things that we read that we have no understanding of whatsoever. So the fact that the summa, the blind person, doesn't understand what it means, light and to benefit from light, right? Which even that is going to be a subject of debate up ahead, whether he doesn't or not. But let's assume you claim not. But we read the Maaseh Merkava Yechezkel, which is this vision that he sees of angels in the heavens. Nobody understands that. And yet we read it anyway. So what's the difference? So Rabbi Yehuda, he says, Hatam ba'avanta deliba tal yamilta. V'ha kamechavim b'yada. Ha chamishum hana'ahu. V'ha leitle hana'a. Okay, he says, okay, maybe I should want to check the exact translation of these words for a minute. But he's basically distinguishing between what the idea of reading from the Navi is. And just one second, he says, right, it depends upon comprehension of the heart. And you can try to at least comprehend somewhat about what this Maaseh Merkava is, okay? But when regards to the bracha, what bracha are we saying, Yotzer Hamo wrote? We're thanking God that we benefited from the light. Now, he can't benefit from the light. Now, the Maaseh Merkava, we're trying to say we have some sort of basic understanding, okay, there's angels above. There's a concept we can grasp. But when it comes to, I could say, I understand what it means to benefit from light, a blind person who is blind from birth really has no understanding of that. To which we're going to have a response. Okay, I want to point out, by the way, the Tosefta ended with the words Amrulo the Rabbi Yehuda, Beit Safu b'merkava v'lo ra'u tomi mehen. Period. That was the Tosefta. Then we try to explain what would Rabbi Yehuda be able to respond to that. We don't really have his response. And likewise, we don't really have the rabbi's response to Rabbi Yehuda on this one. But now we're going to see, why do the rabbis think that the blind person can be Pores al Shma? It's a great line. Rabbanan itle hana'a. What do you mean? A blind person does benefit from light. Ki Rabbi Yossi, as Rabbi Yossi says, Tanya. Now we're going to have a story. Amar Rabbi Yossi, kol yamai hayiti mitzta'er al mikra zeh. Okay, all my life I was upset about this pasuk. We've seen this phrase before, right? All my life I was upset about a particular verse. This comes up in a number of places. Here's the verse that bothered him. I was grasping, right, trying to touch something, right, in the dark, like can't think of the word, but I was, wandering around trying to find my way around by touch. Just like a blind person fumbles around in the darkness, gropes, thank you, that's the word, groping in the darkness to find his way. So he says, why did it say a blind person in the darkness? A blind person is groping even when it's light. The blind person has no distinction between light and dark. Until one time, something happened to me and it enlightened me, okay, literally, right? Enlightened, no pun intended. But, right, and this is a good example of until you meet a person who's, has some issues or you don't really understand what it's like for them. You look at them, you say, oh, clearly you don't get benefit from light at all. But then he says, what happened? Here's my story. I see a blind person walking, holding a torch. So he says, Amarli, Amartilo, Beni, Avukazo Lamalacha. He says to the blind man, why are you carrying this torch? Amarli, he said to me, if I don't walk around with a light, no one's going to notice me. But if I walk around with a light, everybody will see a torch, everyone will see me. And then they'll help me and they'll make sure I don't bump into things and they'll make sure I don't have any issues. And then it allows other people to be able to help me. So therefore, according to the rabbis, the blind person does benefit from light. And therefore, right, it's all about, and I think about this a lot, it's all about your perspective, right? How you see things and how do you get a better perspective? By meeting other people that have these issues and understanding better what they're going through. Okay, new Mishnah. Kohen sheyesh biyadav mumin. Okay, if we talk about disabilities and other things, now we're going to talk about a Kohen who has some sort of blemish. Okay, right now it's going to be on his hands. We'll see also on other parts of his body. Lo isat kapat. He cannot do Birkat Kohanim. This is a very interesting topic. Okay, first of all, what's the issue? The issue here is that we don't want him to attract attention and people are going to look at him. Now, we know, right? You see someone on the street who looks a little bit strange. Some people stop and stare. Right? It's not exactly appropriate, but it's an instinctive reaction by many people. So we don't want you to be in shul and there's somebody strange looking and he's up there on the bima and he's basically, right, doing your Birkat Kohanim with his hands out. Now you might say, what do you mean? Don't they cover it with a talit? Not then. Okay, that was a development later. But his hands are out blessing you and you'll start looking and, now what's the problem with you looking? So Rashi says, right, I think he doesn't say it here, but he says it elsewhere, that the reason is, right, now he says it here, לפי שעה מסתכלים בו, ואמרינם במסכת חגיגה, המסתכל בכהנים בשעה שנושאים לכפיהם, עיניו כהות, לפי שהשכינה שורה על ידיהם. We don't want them looking at the Kohen. Because the Shechina is there between the fingers of the Kohanim, and therefore, if you look, you'll go blind. Okay, going back to the blind issue. Okay, or you'll lose part of your vision because you're basically looking at the Shechina. Tosfot says, okay, not here, but Tosfot says in Chagiga there, says, I know what Rashi is talking about. That's only in the temple. There's no Shechina between the hands of the Kohanim in a regular shul. When it's not the temple, that's in the temple. So Tosfot says, right, if you, I'm sure you've heard this, right? At least I used to hear this growing up, right? Don't look at the Kohanim, you go blind, right? And you always think that's really weird, right? It's not exactly what we normally say. And in fact, Tosfot says, yeah, it's not the case, okay? So if you think it's not the case, go with Tosfot. It's not the case. Tosfot says the reason why we don't look at the Kohanim is because we want you to focus when you're saying the bracha. And if you're looking, and it's not just at the Kohanim, you're not supposed to be looking. You're not supposed to be looking at anything else. You're supposed to be looking, I guess, at your sitter, down, closing your eyes, focusing inwardly to accept the bracha. Now, the big question there is, why to accept a bracha do you need intent? That's a whole other question, which I don't have a good answer, but it definitely is a reason that resonates with me much more than this, you'll go blind, which I see someone wrote, right? It always scared me as a kid, right? It's like one of those scary things that sounds like, trying to instill the fear of God in us, but in a bit of a weird manner, right? In a way that it's harder to relate to. But I always related much more to this. I had always heard this. I never knew it was this machloket here, Rashi Tosfot, based on our sugya about this idea. And it always resonated with me much more, this idea of having kavanah when you're getting the bracha, that you're focusing on accepting the bracha, that there's something to be said for that. Anyway, that's an interesting thing that comes out of here. So Kohen, don't do Birkat Kohanim. If you have this blemish on your fingers, it'll attract people's attention and distract them from this. Yeah, and this is why people put them under talitot. It's all based on this. Okay, that's why, right, people always get covered under the talit. Right, when I was a kid, my father always went up, so I was always stuck behind, and his friend used to put me under his talit. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af mishayu yadav tzvuot satis. Anyone who had their hands colored with either a blue dye, maybe some people say it's a red dye. Okay, your hands are covered with dye, lo yisad kapav, right? It's not just a blemish. This has nothing to do with that you have something wrong with you. This is just anything that will attract attention. Tana. So Braita says, Mumin she'amru b'farav yadav v'raglav, not just on your hands, also your legs, also your face. If you have white spots on your hands, also you can't. Tanya Namihachi, there's a Braita to support Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says he was an Amora. Yadav bo hakaniyot leisat kapav. Akumot akushot leisat kapav. If your hands are bent or to the side, right? Also some deformity in your hands. Lo yisat kapav. Amar Rav Asi Chayfani ubashyani. If you come from Haifa or Beit She'an, this is a fascinating one. Lo yisat kapav. Okay, for speech therapists out there, you'll see. Tanya Namihachi, we're going to have to understand why. So there's Braita that supports this. Okay, all the people from Beit She'an, Haifa, or Tivon, it's in the north, can't be chazanim. Why? Okay, you might notice when I read an aleph or I read an ayin, I don't really make such a distinction between them because I don't have that guttural sound, but the ayin is supposed to be from the right guttural ah, right, rather than ah. But they flip it. Okay, maybe it's not so bad. I just ignore it, right? But other people, if they have it flipped, they use the ayin as a guttural sound. The aleph is a guttural sound and the ayin not a guttural sound. So because they say it wrong, we don't allow them to have these positions where they're basically getting up in public saying things in the wrong manner. Okay, so they all have it wrong basically, and therefore we don't allow it. Here comes an interesting story, not exactly a positive one. Amarle Rabbi Chia Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe. Okay, Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rebbe, pay attention because soon we'll go to his father Rebbe. Rabbi Chia says to Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe, you have a really bad voice. So thank God you weren't a Levi, because if you were a Levi, you wouldn't be allowed to go sing with all the Leviim because your voice is terrible. Okay, so what does Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe do? Maybe he was young at the time. He goes to tell his father, right? He tells Rabbi Chia and says, look what Rabbi Chia said about me. Ata Amarle Lavua. So Amarle, the father says, right, this is like when you're getting beaten up in school and your father says, or your mother says, go tell them tomorrow, I'll give you something to say back. So he says, Zil Emale, go tell him, when you read the pasuk, v'chikiti la'Hashem, which means, and I wait for God, it's a beautiful pasuk, lo nimtzeit mecharef u'mekadev, do you not end up desecrating the name of God? Because how does he switches his chet and his hey. He can't pronounce chet, Rabbi Chia. He pronounces it as a hey. So it says, v'hikiti la'Hashem, and I will hit God. Wow, that's terrible that you say when you read that pasuk, you say it like that. So basically he comes to say to him, right, you think I have a disability because I can't sing properly. You have your own disabilities and everybody has some sort of issue where they can't do something perfectly. So don't start pointing out my weaknesses when you've got your weaknesses as well. Okay, it's a very interesting story. Okay, Amar Rav Huna, Zav Ligan lo yisad, right, and obviously a very strong message. Amar Rav Huna, Zav Ligan lo yisad kapav. Okay, what is Zav Ligan? Okay, this is a classic example. You have to look in Rashi. Zav Ligan, Rashi says, Einav zofotima, constantly has tearing in his eyes. So again, it's something that attracts attention. So he shouldn't do Nesiat Kapayim. He shouldn't do the Birkat Kohanim. What do you mean? There was a guy who did this in the community of Rav Huna, and Rav Huna didn't stop him. Now we have a fascinating line, which again, these are just great. Every line here is great. He was known in his city. Once you're known in your city, then people don't pay attention to it anymore. They're just used to it, right? If someone has a disability or someone looks a particular way or someone this, so the first time you see them, the second time you see them, right? This is the whole reason for inclusion. Once they're used to seeing you, they don't notice anymore how different you are. And it doesn't strike them as odd, right? It's just they're just used to it. They grew up with it. They always saw it. So here's a great line about how the halacha changes in that case, because it's all about, are people going to look at you and pay attention, right? And not be thinking about their Birkat Kohanim. So another situation, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Suma ve'echad me'einav lo yisad kapav. If you're blind in one eye, and the assumption is that your eye is shut or something where it's noticeable. If it's not noticeable, this isn't an issue, but can't do Nesiat Kapayim. There was a guy, b'shevavute de Rabbi Yochanan, of a paris yadeh. So again, same thing. Havadash bi'iro haya. Again, everybody knew him, so it wasn't anything that seemed strange to them. Tanya Nami Hachi, a Braita to support this. Suma be'achami navli yisad kapavi mayadash bi'iro. If he was known in his town, mutar, it's permitted. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Misha yu yadav tzvuot lo yisad kapav. Again, if your hand is full of dye, everyone's going to look at you. But not if what? Tana in the bright it says, Im rov anshe ha'ir melachtam b'kach mutar. If most of the people in the city, this is what they do for a living, and all their hands look like that, well, then again, you don't stand out from anybody else, and it's permitted. Okay, next Mishnah, we'll do this kind of quickly. This is a Mishnah that seems to list, we'll see this in the Gemara, but it's hard to read this Mishnah without that, which is, this is a Mishnah that lists all sorts of things that were known that heretics did. Or at the end, we'll see things that weren't exactly heretics, but weren't exactly within what the rabbis believed. And by heretics, we usually mean people who believed in the written Torah and not by the oral tradition, right? The written Torah only. They held, heretics, that you can't daven with colored clothing. So we can't let him daven in anything. Basically, we basically say this guy could be a heretic. Don't let him daven. If he says, I won't daven with sandals on, again, we're worried that he's a heretic, so we don't let him daven in any way. Tfilato doesn't mean his prayer, it means his tefillin. If you make your tefillin from your head round like a ball, that you can't do this. This is for a different reason. Sakana, the aim ba mitzvah. It's dangerous because what if you're walking with your tefillin and you knock into a wall or knock into the top of a door or something, and the round will just shove into your head and cause damage. So don't make them rounded. That's why they're always flat. Okay. And you won't fulfill the mitzvah either. Now, this is why we brought up tefillin, because if you put it on your forehead, now they believed al yadecha and al yadecha and beinenecha. Beinenecha, they understood literally, the people who took the Torah B'chtav seriously, and al yadecha, on your hand. But the rabbi said up further, higher up, both on your head and on your arm, and therefore if they do it lower, right, also. That's derech minut, that's heresy. Tzipan zahavu nitanal beit unkli shelo. If you cover them with gold or put them on top of your clothes instead of directly on your skin, on your arm, hareze derech hachitzoni. This isn't minut, but it's people who are on the outs. Okay, they're not exactly heretics, but they're not within the people. So the Gemara says, "My taima chashinan shema minut is rekabo." We're worried maybe the issue is you don't let him do it right then. It could be tomorrow, yes, but there's a concern that right now maybe he's thinking about being a heretic, and that's why he said this. But wait, there's the source. Why did they even say this if we already have a Mishnah? The source says, square tefillin or halachal Moshe Sinai. So that's already the same thing it says in our Mishnah, basically, other than the halachal Moshe Sinai. So two possible answers. Amarava b'tifran u'va'al chasonan. He says it's the stitching, and that has to be square, meaning it can't be rectangular. It's not saying it can't be round, it can't be rectangular or some other shape. And the angles have to be the angles of a square, not a rectangle. The Mishnah is talking about round like a ball. This is saying, even if it's not round like a ball and it's flat, but maybe the top part is rounded, right? If it's flat where it won't get shoved into your head, but then above it's rounded, that's also not right. It has to be square. Okay, so that's why we have both sources, because our Mishnah doesn't tell us everything. Okay, with that, we'll finish for today. Start the new Mishnah tomorrow. Have a great day, everyone.